make sure it's going here. Check, check. And this is going, and that's how it was before, right?
Okay, and we're back with Allison and Annalee. During the pause, we were talking a little bit about theoretical meaning because it's a little bit trickier than interior and exterior meaning. Allison, why don't you tell me, let's start again. What was the question you asked about theoretical meaning, or what was your thought about that?
Well, I was thinking maybe the theoretical meaning, which is why does this matter, might be more big picture. So you might have to use more context to figure out why it matters, while the interior meaning is more, I guess, more specific.
Yeah, a lot of times the interior meaning is going to be more specific because, remember, the interior meaning is always about one very specific action or circumstance. So if you'll recall sentence 4, the exterior meaning was he threw his brush down on the floor. The interior meaning was that he expresses his frustration and his annoyance with the speech bother, oh blow, and hang spring cleaning. So that's right. The interior meaning is often more specific. In the theoretical meaning, we do have to use context much more for that. I think another very important phrase to use to remember what theoretical meaning is the phrase an abstract concept, right? So that's another important thing to remember, that interior meaning, when we're talking about feelings or emotions or beliefs or motives, that's always something that's about a very particular circumstance. And I'm going to some of these phrases will recur. The particular circumstance, meaning some specific action or some specific reality, such as throwing his brush down, right? His interior meaning of annoyance is specifically tied to the specific circumstance of throwing down his brush. Whereas, when we talk about what is calling him up above, is something calling him, does that have to do with the motion or the action of what Mole is doing?
Not really.
Not really, no. It's something like the spring that enters his house in the third sentence, remember? We talked about how that is more of an abstract, because in a way it's a little bit invisible. We don't actually see spring entering his house. We don't see something calling him the way we could see if Mole is calling to a friend or calling to another animal. Does that help you a little bit with that distinction between theoretical and interior? Good. Now, what I'd like to do is I'd like to ask you both to tell me a little bit more about the theoretical meaning, or to tell me what else we can find here, because when we before we took our pause, we talked a little bit about the sun and the air and the warm grass of a great meadow. And here you're going to find theoretical meaning. It requires both context and it requires also inference and hypothesizing. And what we also want to think about and try to connect are the different parts of the paragraph, because we had the first part about the chores and the spring cleaning, and the second part about the sun, the air, and the grass calling him. And we also want to connect this to the idea of spring being a spirit of divine discontent and longing. And I'd like to start there, because I think that is perhaps the most important sentence in the paragraph for the theoretical meaning. If we're talking about a spirit of divine discontent and longing, how do you think you can connect that to the other parts of the passage, to the something that was calling him above? Because if we think about the theoretical meaning, two of the important parts are this divine discontent, this spirit which enters his home, and then this something that's calling him from up above. And again, this connection, it's not obvious. The paragraph, the text doesn't tell us to connect these two, but I think we should, because they're both theoretical meaning. Do you have any ideas about that?
Well, I guess divine discontent kind of conveys impatience, and then also the longing is something, he's longing to go outside, something is calling him. So I guess you can connect the longing to something calling him outside.
Excellent. That's an excellent connection. Now, we want to make connections and we want to see similarities, but we want to also remember to remember that we need to recognize the differences and make sure that we note what the differences are here. Now, how do we need to understand the difference between longing and calling? How are those two functioning as different theoretical meanings here?
For like theoretical meanings, I think longing means like he's like dreaming about it and like wants it, and then calling is more like he has to do it now because like he feels like someone's like telling him to, or it's like the right thing to do.
Okay, excellent. So the longing is something that's a little bit more about dreaming. He's not actually doing anything. Whereas when he's being called, then he's actually taking action. That was very good. Yes, Alice?
I'd say the longing is more something that's kind of passively happening, while the calling is something that's very active and deliberate.
Okay, could you explain to me how you mean the longing is passively happening?
Well, that's not the right word. Like, I guess he's not really acting upon it. It's just a thought he has in his mind.
Okay, good. So we also have
Or not he has, the spring.
a thought that, well, who has that thought?
He
That's
does,
a good question.
he does.
Is it so the mole, or is it Spring that has the longing
Well,
and the
Spring
thought?
has a longing, but he can sense that.
Okay, so this gets to be a little bit complicated. We have to figure out where is the longing an attribute of Spring and where is it a longing of the mole. Let's read the sentence once more and let's think about that. Spring was moving in the air above and in the earth below and around him, penetrating even his dark and lowly little house with its spirit of divine discontent and longing. So to whom does the spirit of divine discontent and longing belong? Does it belong to Spring or to the mole?
The spring.
Belongs to Spring. Does it also belong to the mole, and if so, why?
Well, I don't think it belongs to the mole, but I think the spring's spirit that he can sense the longing and he can sense the divine discontent. So it's
Good.
kind of like through his perspective. Not really, but.
No, I think that's exactly right, that he is sensing the spirit of discontent that's not his own spirit.
Yeah.
So usually this is again where we have to pay very close attention to something that looks very simple. We might have forgotten that the spirit of longing was actually belonging to Spring and not to the mole. Now, I think I'd also like to make the note that, or I'd like to point out that the spirit of Spring, what's happened in this sentence is the spirit of Spring has entered his house, and then Mole is surrounded by it. And I think as you pointed out, he perceives that spirit of Spring. All right, I should point out here that, as you probably noticed, we're mixing the theoretical meaning with other meanings, but it's really predominantly driven by this idea of longing and calling. Now I think, Annalie, to continue with the point that you made before, that the longing is something where he's only dreaming, whereas the calling is something where he's acting, I would also point out that an important distinction there is that this longing is something that that the mole is feeling himself, whereas the calling is something where he's being called by someone or something outside of him. And now this is where the theoretical meaning can become very complex and rich, because we can note that the spirit of longing is something that is an attribute of Mole. It's something that he feels himself. Whereas his action, the action is something that comes from outside of him. It's a call that comes from outside of him. And I think this was an excellent point that you made, Allison, which I'm just making very clear about the fact that it's an action that in some ways is not his own. It's not his own motive.
But he's like,
Right.
but he's perceiving the calling because it's not physical, I guess. So it is kind of his brain, right?
Well, that's a good question, right? And there we'd have to get into the complexity of the relation. It's he's perceiving something, he's perceiving a calling that's causing him to act. But the source of the call is outside of him.
Okay.
And you could say with the calling, he listens, he hears the call, and that's the cause of the action.
Okay.
So you see here what I mean by theoretical meaning. Here we're talking about the specific passage where he's being called, but it's not about a specific action. It's not tied to his brush. It does happen while he is going to his tunnel, but we really have the three separate parts of the theoretical meaning here. We have the calling, something or someone outside is calling him, or rather something or someone up above is calling him, and then he hears it. And hearing or listening is something that we have to infer. It's not given to us here at all. And finally, as you pointed out, Allison, we have the action, that because of this someone or something calling him, because he hears it, his body moves into action. So here what we have with the theoretical meaning is something like a series of abstract concepts that describe how is it that action happens. What are the different parts of this action? Well, it's not just an action, it's something up above calling him, it's his hearing it, and then his being moved to action.
Okay.
Good. Also, I think this is an excellent example of how often group discussion or dialogue can be very helpful for putting together different ideas. That you had one idea, Annalie, and you had another idea, Allison, and they were both very good separate, but together, when you put them together, they made a lot more sense then. Now, let's have a quick look at maybe the entire paragraph. Is there anything else you think that's important that we've missed? Now, it might be hard to believe that we might have missed something. Maybe not at this point, we might have got everything, but let's have a quick look, because when we're reading and when we're checking for meaning, we have to be sure that we've gotten everything. And maybe there's some small detail that we haven't yet gotten to, which is going to prove to be very important. So I'd like you to have a look. You can scan the sentences silently to see if there's anything else that sticks out, and especially anything that you think we could connect to a topic which we've discussed before.
It goes, so he scraped and scratched and scrabbled and scrooged, and then it basically repeats that sentence. So this is an example of both repetition and kind of, I think, a little bit of alliteration, because they all start with S's. And I think the way the writer wrote it conveys how eager he is to get up into the sun and nature. And it says, working busily with his little paws and muttering to himself. So it shows how he's working hard to get back up, and he wasn't working hard on spring cleaning. So it shows how he's much more excited about the idea of going up into nature in the spring than he is for spring cleaning.
That's fantastic. Yes, I think to take your first point that he's eager, and we see that with the alliteration and the repetition of the SC sounds in scrabbled, screwed, and scratched. I think the other interesting connection to make with being eager is, in a way, that's a kind of counterpart to, or a transformation of, his being annoyed. Remember how he was annoyed and aggravated when he threw down the brush, but now we see that he's eager. And I think your second point was also excellent, that he's working, what was the phrase you used? He's working happily, or...
I'm not
anyway,
sure, sorry.
The fact that he's working eagerly, you might have repeated eagerly, I can't remember. Now, what is that a counterpart to that we saw earlier in the paragraph?
That he was working for spring cleaning, but he wasn't doing it eagerly. He was doing it reluctantly.
Exactly, that's right. Now, from that contrast, we see a contrast of interior meaning, right? Because we have the monotonous, dull work of chores for spring cleaning, but we have the eager, busy work of scraping his way to the surface. Now here there's a key word, we talked about keywords a little bit, that we could use for a theory. If we wanted to talk about the theoretical meaning of work in this paragraph, we could say, well, there are two different kinds of work. There's work that you find monotonous and dull. and there's work that you're eager and happy to do. Now you see how that's theoretical, because when we're talking about work in that sense, it doesn't have to do with just spring cleaning or
Yes.
just tunneling your way to the surface. We're talking about an abstract concept of what work is. We're talking about a general idea that applies to many, many different parts of life, and not just this one specific circumstance.
Mm.
And as you recall also, we talked about interior meaning as being tied to one specific circumstance or one specific action. So I think this is an excellent example of how the theoretical meaning, such as work, is something that we derive from an interior meaning, right?
Mhm.
This idea of work being either monotonous or something we're happily engaged in, we had that idea because of the interior meaning in this paragraph, because of the interior meaning of the chores and the tunneling to the surface, but we abstract away from that circumstance. You're familiar with the use of the word abstract as a verb?
Yeah.
Means you start with something particular and concrete, but you abstract away to create a theoretical concept that really doesn't have to do with the concrete particular anymore. Good. Well, I think that was excellent for both seeing connections and seeing how so many times there's still even more that you didn't find.
Yes.
And what you're gonna obviously find is you simply don't have time to find everything. Maybe as you get better and better, you can more quickly find more and more. But again, I hope you can remember this so that you can stay more alert to pay attention as you read. Now, let's ask the question once more. Is there anything else that we think is important in this paragraph which we have not yet discussed? Yes.
I just have a question. What does oblow mean?
Which word?
Oblow.
Oh, blow. Ah, yes. That I've not actually heard that phrase used before. This book was written in the early part of the 20th century by the man Kenneth Grahame, but he's an Englishman. He was an Englishman, meaning he didn't grow up or he didn't live in America. And so, of course, language is different both in different countries, but also in different times. So he was writing about 100 years ago in a different country. And that's an excellent question to lead into another tip I'd like to give you when you're reading, which is that you often are going to encounter books which come from different time periods in different countries. Have you read any books that are from different time periods before?
Yeah.
What have you read from a different time period?
I guess not like very different, but The Great Gatsby.
Very good. The Great Gatsby is from about 1920s in America.
Jane Eyre.
And Jane Eyre from, I think, the 18th or 19th century in England. That's right. And what did you find it was like reading Jane Eyre?
I think their lifestyle was very different, so in some ways it was kind of hard to, hard to relate, hard to put yourself in their situation, but there obviously are some universal themes that carry throughout different time periods. So that's how I kind of related to the book and thought about the characters' emotions.
That's right. Well, so I think, Allison, as you pointed out with this word oblo, that's a piece of language that's foreign to us today because it's from a different time and place. In the same way in Jane Eyre, you have an entire way of life. People's entire days and modes of transport and ways of existing are completely different than what we're living today. And this is, in fact, another great challenge of reading books. This is both the great challenge, but also the great reward, because if you can learn to work your way through these strange words and these different ways of life, then you become much better at reading. And really, that's the only way to be able to read successfully and understand the meaning. But to answer your question, Annalie, because I haven't really answered your question, what does oblo mean? Well, what do you think it means, or what do you think he's expressing? Because we can infer certain things.
Yeah, because like using context, because it's also he's like also saying like I'm like done with spring cleaning, so it's probably like maybe like blow it away and like bye.
Okay, interesting. Oh, blow it away. What about you, Allison? Do you have any guesses?
I think it's just, I guess, a phrase that can be used when you're dissatisfied or annoyed.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think, a contemporary equivalent would be something like, oh man. Or,
Yeah.
Well, contemporary for me, I don't know. What would you or your classmates say if you're frustrated?
I think people say, oh man.
Oh, they still do. Okay,
Yeah.
so I'm not that old. Yeah, great. Well, so I think what this shows us, and you mentioned, Allison, that when you read Jane Eyre, you see there's still universal things. Even though, Annalie, the language is different, even though the word oblo is different and foreign to us, that's the exterior meaning, because the speech itself, the words that are spoken, is a kind of exterior meaning. But the sentiment, the belief or the motive, the interior meaning, it's actually something that's very familiar. So even though the word itself might be foreign, the sense, the interior meaning is something that is universal and that we can still understand. We just have to think about it in terms of our own language. Good. So that was a question. Oh, right, we were asking ourselves if there's anything else in the paragraph that we think we missed. Nothing else?
I don't think so.
No? I don't see anything right now either. Good. Now, I know I asked that question 2 or 3 times, and I did that on purpose, partly because we have to do that when we're reading, but also you have to remember that reading, when we first learn to read, it's really fun and it's easy. And we don't really have to do this. But when you get to be a little bit older in junior high or high school, you have to start working hard like this and going back and back and back again at something, especially if you don't understand it. And now this is something that you have to especially do in the beginning, when you're first learning how to understand very, very completely and very thoroughly. But I don't take this much time with the paragraph. I can go a little bit faster, and you'll be able to get there too. So that's something I'd like to remind you, or tell you rather, that even though right now this might seem like this takes forever, and how could I ever read an entire book this way? Well, obviously no. If we read an entire book at the same rate that we read the first paragraph, it might take you 2 years, or however long to read the book. But that's not going to be the case. You're going to find you can go faster and faster as you get going. And the other thing to remember is you can't always get the full, complete meaning in one sitting. You might even read through a passage 2 or 3 times, and still not get everything. So even after you've finished reading a book, when you're working on the essay, it can be helpful to go back to a paragraph or go back to a passage and study it closely again and ask yourself, well, I have these notes and I have some good notes and I think I have some good points, but let me ask myself, is there anything else in this paragraph, in this passage, that I didn't pick up the first time? So that this is, in a word, you could say this is about being thorough and being patient and having to go back again and again to make sure you understand it. Good. Any other questions about the meaning types? Again, we talked about the linguistic meaning, and then the 3 primary meaning types, exterior meaning being the first one, what happens in the outside world in actions and speech. Interior meaning being the beliefs, feelings, sentiments, and motives of characters. And then finally, the 3rd, theoretical meaning of abstract concepts.
If you were doing this for a play, how would that translate?
So with the play, it's It's very similar because the meaning types are the same. However,
Yeah.
one of the challenges with the play, what do we have in a novel or in a book like this that we don't have in a play?
Descriptors of what's like physically going on.
That's
I
right.
mean,
Like also kind of what he's like thinking.
Good. So when you talk, Allison, about the descriptors of what's going on, you could say that's the narrator.
yeah.
Broadly speaking, the narrator telling us what's happening. But I think, Annalie, what you point out very well is the explanation of what the character is thinking. Because in a play, we only ever hear what someone is saying. Now,
Like
sometimes.
dialogue.
Hmm?
You only hear dialogue, right?
Exactly. Now, sometimes a character might be talking alone in what's called a monologue. And sometimes a character will talk in what's called sotto voce, which means in a very low whisper. But we still don't hear what is the character thinking. And I think what we see here is that the narrator can tell us much more information and say much more explicitly than a play can. And what that means is in a work of drama, we have to infer so much more. And we have to be aware that so much more is going to be hidden. Just like, Annalie, you were able to infer about winter and hibernation, which is not on the page at all. And it's not even, it's barely hinted at by the concept of spring. In the same way, if you're working with a play, you're going to have to be inferring a whole lot more and studying a lot more closely. Good. Any other questions? Okay, well, thank you. I hope you enjoyed that. I hope you found that you were able to understand.
Very helpful.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.